The cafeteria smelled of burnt coffee and sweat, the kind of place where you learn quickly who runs things. Trays clattered, guards pretended not to see, and in the corner sat Marcus, the man everyone called King of Cell Block C. When the new inmate walked in, the noise dropped a little. He was black, mid-30s, calm in a way that didn't belong here. No twitch, no fear, just steady eyes scanning the room like he'd been here before. Marcus didn't like that. He leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Fresh meat," he muttered. "Thinks he's Bruce Lee." A few of his boys laughed. The new guy said nothing, just picked up a tray and kept walking, quiet and polite. Too polite for prison. That's when Marcus made his move. He stood up, swaggered over, and accidentally bumped the tray out of his hands. The sound echoed. Metal, food, silence. Everyone watched. Marcus grabbed a steaming cup of coffee, lifted it slow like a showman, and poured it straight over the new inmate's head. The cafeteria froze. The new guy didn't scream, didn't even blink. He just exhaled once and looked up. That's when Marcus realized he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because seconds later, that quiet man was no longer standing still. And by the time the guards rushed in, King of Cell Block C was on the floor, crying, broken, begging, "Stay with me until the end." Because what the guards discovered later about that quiet inmate changed everything they thought they knew about him. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The concrete walls of Blackwater State Penitentiary had seen their share of broken men. 23 years of housing the worst society had to offer had turned the place into something more than just a prison. It was an ecosystem, a brutal hierarchy where respect was earned through violence and weakness was punished without mercy. Marcus "Tank" Williams had ruled Cell Block C for 4 years running. 6'2" of pure intimidation wrapped in orange fabric, with arms like tree trunks and a reputation that preceded him through every corridor. His crew of loyal followers moved through the prison like they owned it, and in many ways, they did. Tank had built his empire the old-fashioned way, blood and fear. He decided who ate in peace and who went hungry. He determined which inmates got protection and which ones became targets. Even the guards had learned to look the other way when Tank handled business. It kept order, and that made everyone's job easier. The morning David Chen walked through those steel doors, the temperature in Cell Block C seemed to drop a few degrees. Not because anyone knew who he was, not because his paperwork said anything threatening, but because something about the way he moved, the way he carried himself, felt different. David's intake processing had been routine. Another mid-30s. Offender caught up in the system. Assault charges stemming from a bar fight that went too far. 3 to 5 years. Eligible for parole in 18 months with good behavior. The intake officer barely looked up from his paperwork as he processed the new arrival. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Just another number to fill another cell. But if that officer had looked closer, really looked, he might have noticed something different about David Chen. The way his feet were positioned, even while standing still. The way his breathing remained controlled, despite being processed into one of the most violent prisons in the state. The way his eyes took in every detail of his surroundings without appearing to stare. David had been a free man for 34 years. He had owned a successful martial arts studio in downtown Portland, teaching traditional Taekwondo to everyone from nervous children to seasoned adults looking to get back in shape. He had lived a disciplined life built on respect, honor, and the ancient techniques passed down from his Korean master over 2 decades ago. Now he was prisoner number 847291, and the next 3 years of his life would be spent behind these concrete walls. The cell David was assigned to was controlled by Tank's influence, just like everything else in Cell Block C. His cellmate was a nervous young man named Tommy Rodriguez, barely 22, who had been counting down the days until his own release for the past 8 months. "You seem different," Tommy whispered after the lights went dark on David's first night. Most new guys, they come in scared or angry or trying to act tough. You're just calm. David set aside the worn paperback book he'd been reading and looked across the small cell. Fear and anger cloud judgment, he said quietly. Clarity comes from stillness. Tommy didn't understand what that meant, but something in the older man's voice made him feel safer than he had in months. There was a weight to David's words that spoke of experience beyond these walls, knowledge that ran deeper than prison survival tactics. The next morning brought David's first trip to the cafeteria, and Tank was waiting. He had positioned himself and his crew near the serving line, making sure every inmate would have to walk past them. It was a power move, a reminder of the hierarchy that governed this place. Fresh meat needed to learn the rules quickly, and Tank was always eager to be the teacher. David entered the cafeteria carrying himself with the same quiet dignity he had maintained since his arrival. He moved through the breakfast line methodically, his eyes scanning the room with practiced awareness. Not paranoid, not afraid, just alert in the way someone becomes when they've spent decades teaching others how to defend themselves. The food was exactly what he expected. Watery scrambled eggs that had been sitting under heat lamps too long, toast that had seen better days, coffee that looked like it had been brewed sometime last week. He took what was offered without complaint and began looking for a place to sit. Tank watched the new inmate's every movement, sizing him up like a predator evaluating prey. This one was different from the usual fresh fish who stumbled through those doors. No nervous glances, no obvious fear, no attempts at false bravado, just a man getting breakfast like he'd done it 1,000 times before. That calm confidence irritated Tank more than outright defiance would have. Defiance he could crush immediately. Fear he could exploit for weeks. But this quiet dignity, this unshakable composure, felt like a challenge to everything Tank had built his reputation on. Tank's voice boomed across the cafeteria, causing conversations to pause and heads to turn. Look what we got here, boys. Fresh meat thinks he's special. David continued walking toward an empty table, his tray steady in his hands, his expression unchanged. He had dealt with bullies before, though not in quite this setting. The principle remained the same. Show no fear, but avoid unnecessary confrontation. Tank stepped directly into David's path, his massive frame blocking the way to the tables. His crew flanked him on both sides, grins spreading across their faces as they anticipated the show they'd seen dozens of times before. "I'm talking to you, boy," Tank said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "When somebody speaks to you in here, you answer. That's how respect works." David stopped walking and looked up at Tank calmly. The height difference was significant, but David's posture remained relaxed, balanced. "I heard you," he said simply. "I just don't have anything to say." The response caught Tank off guard. Most new inmates either cowered in empty threats. This terror or tried to act tough with man was doing neither. He was just standing there, completely unrest by the display of intimi strongerdation that had broken men than him. "You don't have anything to say?" Tank repeated, his voice getting louder, drawing more attention from around the cafeteria. "Maybe you don't understand how things work around here. See, I run this block. That means everything that happens here goes through me, including where some nobody like you gets to sit." David remained perfectly still, his breathing slow and controlled. Years of meditation and disciplined training had taught him to find calm in the center of any storm. This was just another storm, no different from the countless sparring matches where opponents had tried to intimidate him before the real fight began. "I understand," David said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. "You're the man in charge. I'm just trying to eat my breakfast." Tank's face flushed red with anger. The new inmate's calm was making him look weak in front of his crew, in front of the entire cafeteria. That couldn't stand. In a place like this, perception was everything. And right now, the perception was that some nobody fresh fish wasn't showing proper respect to the king. Without warning, Tank reached out and shoved David hard in the chest. The force should have sent the smaller man stumbling backward, maybe even knocked him down completely. But David's feet seemed rooted to the floor. He absorbed the impact with a slight shift of his weight and remained standing exactly where he had been. Tank blinked in surprise. He had put real force behind that shove, enough to move men twice David's size. But this quiet inmate hadn't budged an inch. His balance had barely been affected. "Did you just—" Tank started to say, but David cut him off with a look that made the gang leader's words die in his throat. For just a moment, David's mask of calm slipped slightly, and Tank caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. It was like looking into the eyes of a trained fighter who had been pretending to be helpless. The depth of knowledge and capability that flashed through David's gaze spoke of years of disciplined training, of techniques mastered through countless hours of practice. The moment stretched like a wire pulled taut. Tank stared into David's eyes and felt something he hadn't experienced in years behind bars: uncertainty. The quiet man's gaze held depths that spoke of training, discipline, and a confidence that came from knowing exactly what he was capable of. But Tank was the king of Cell Block C. Kings don't back down from challenges, especially not from some fresh fish who probably couldn't survive a week without protection. "You think you're tough, new guy?" Tank snarled, stepping closer until he was towering over David. "You think those calm little eyes can stand up to what I got waiting for you?" David's response was barely above a whisper, but every person in the immediate area heard it clearly. "I think you should let me eat my breakfast in peace." The cafeteria had gone completely silent now. Every conversation had stopped. Even the guards at the far end of the room had noticed something was happening, though they weren't moving to intervene yet. In their experience, these situations usually resolved themselves quickly with the new inmate learning his place. Tank's crew was getting restless. They fed off their leader's energy, and right now that energy was building towards something explosive. One of them, a wiry man with teardrop tattoos named Snake, stepped forward eagerly. "Tank, you want me to teach this boy some manners?" Snake cracked his knuckles, eager to please his boss and put on a show for the growing crowd of spectators. But Tank held up a hand to stop him. This was personal now. The new inmate's unshakable calm was eating away at his authority with every second that passed. He needed to end this himself, decisively and brutally, to restore the fear that kept his empire intact. "Nah," Tank said, never taking his eyes off David. "I got this one personally." What happened next would be whispered about in cell blocks across 3 states for years to come. Tank drew back his massive right fist, putting every ounce of his 260 pounds behind a punch designed to shatter David's jaw. It was the kind of blow that had dropped men half Tank's age, the kind that ended fights before they really began. David saw it coming from the moment Tank's shoulder tensed. 22 years of Taekwondo training had given him an understanding of body mechanics that went beyond conscious thought. The punch was powerful but telegraphed, thrown with emotion instead of technique, rage instead of precision. Time seemed to slow as David's body moved with fluid grace. His left hand came up in a gentle arc, deflecting Tank's punch just enough to send it harmlessly past his head. At the same moment, his right foot pivoted, and his body turned like water flowing around a stone. Tank's eyes went wide as his massive fist met nothing but air. His momentum carried him forward, off balance, exactly where David needed him to be. In one smooth motion, David's right leg swept upward in a perfect roundhouse kick, connecting with Tank's temple with surgical precision. The sound echoed through the cafeteria like a gunshot. Tank's eyes rolled back, and his massive frame crumpled to the concrete floor like a demolished building. The breakfast tray David had been holding clattered beside him, spilling its contents across the ground. The silence in the cafeteria was deafening. Snake and the rest of Tank's crew stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Their invincible leader, The man who had ruled this block through fear and violence for 4 years was unconscious on the floor in front of an inmate who looked like he should be teaching kids at a community center. David looked down at Tank's motionless form, then slowly surveyed the room. Every eye in the cafeteria was locked onto him, waiting to see what would happen next. The power structure that had governed Cell Block C for years had been shattered in the span of 3 seconds. "I asked nicely," David said, his voice still calm and controlled, carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "All I wanted was to eat my breakfast." Snake was the first to recover from the shock. His face twisted with rage as he reached for the makeshift shank hidden in his waistband. "You just signed your death warrant, old man," he hissed, lunging forward with the crude blade aimed at David's ribs. But David was no longer where Snake expected him to be. He had shifted to the side with minimal movement, like smoke drifting on a breeze. Snake's desperate thrust met empty air, and David's elbow struck downward with devastating accuracy, connecting with the nerve cluster at the base of Snake's neck. Snake collapsed instantly, the shank skittering across the floor as his body went limp, 2 down. The rest of Tank's crew backed away, their confidence evaporating like morning mist. The remaining members of Tank's gang looked at each other with growing panic. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. Fresh meat was supposed to cower, beg, submit. They weren't supposed to move like ghosts and strike like lightning. A heavy-set man called Brick stepped forward, his massive hands curling into fists. He had been Tank's N4 for his ability to breakser for 3 years, known bones with his bare hands. "I don't care what kind of kung fu movie garbage you think you know," he growled. "You're about to learn what real prison fighting looks like." Brick charged forward like an angry bull, swinging wild haymakers designed to overwhelm through sheer brutality. David watched him approach with the same calm he had shown Tank, reading Brick's movements like an open book. At the last possible second, David dropped low and swept Brick's legs with a technique called the spinning heel sweep. Brick's forward momentum worked against him as his feet left the ground. David's palm struck upward, catching Brick under the chin with enough force to snap his head back violently. Brick hit the floor hard, his head bouncing off the concrete with a sickening thud. He groaned once and went still, joining Tank and Snake in unconsciousness. The cafeteria erupted in chaos as other inmates began scrambling for exits. Some wanted to avoid being caught in whatever was about to happen next. Others were already planning how they could use this information to their advantage. The guards finally began moving, but they were still 30 seconds away from reaching the center of the disturbance. David straightened his orange jumpsuit and picked up a replacement tray from the serving line. The kitchen staff handed him fresh food with trembling hands, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. He nodded politely and walked calmly to an empty table, sitting down as if nothing had happened. As he began eating his scrambled eggs methodically, conversations slowly resumed around the cafeteria, but they were different now. Hushed, careful, filled with the kind of speculation that spreads through prison populations like wildfire. The power structure that had governed Cell Block C for years had been completely upended in less than 2 minutes. When the guards finally arrived, they found Tank still unconscious, Snake groaning and trying to sit up, and Brick staring at the ceiling with glassy eyes. David sat quietly at his table, finishing his breakfast as if the 3 men on the floor had nothing to do with him. Sergeant Rodriguez, the head of security for Cell Block C, surveyed the scene with experienced eyes. He had been working at Blackwater for 15 years and had seen every kind of violence the place had to offer. But this was different. 3 of the most dangerous inmates in the block were down, and the only person sitting calmly in the middle of it all was a first-day fish who looked like he belonged in a library. "What happened here?" Rodriguez demanded, looking around the cafeteria for answers. "Disagreement over seating arrangements," David replied calmly, not looking up from his eggs. "It got out of hand." Rodriguez looked at the destruction, then at David, then back at the 3 injured inmates being helped to their feet by the medical team that had just arrived. His experience told him there was much more to this story, but prison politics were complicated. Sometimes it was better not to ask too many questions, especially when the answers might complicate things further. Medical attention for the injured, Rodriguez ordered his team. And you, he pointed at David. Solitary confinement, 48 hours. David nodded acceptance. It was a small price to pay for sending a message that would echo through every cell block in the prison. The quiet new inmate wasn't just dangerous. He was untouchable. As guards escorted him away, David caught sight of inmates throughout the cafeteria watching him with expressions he recognized. Some showed newfound respect. Others displayed the kind of curiosity reserved for dangerous predators. A few wore the calculating look of men wondering if they could use this development to their advantage. But it was the fear in their eyes that David noticed most. The same fear that had once belonged exclusively to Tank and his crew had now transferred to him. He had never wanted that kind of attention. But in a place like Blackwater, sometimes survival required making choices that went against your nature. Tommy Rodriguez was waiting in their cell when David returned from solitary 2 days later, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "Man, I thought they might never let you out," he said, helping David settle back onto his bunk. "The whole block's been talking about what you did to Tank and his crew." "Is Tank still planning his revenge?" David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Tommy shook his head. "Tank's in the infirmary with a concussion. Snake can barely move his right arm. And Brick's been walking into walls since it happened. Word is Tank's calling in favors from other blocks, trying to put together something big." David nodded grimly. This was exactly what he had feared would happen. His actions in self-defense had escalated a simple bullying situation into something that could consume the entire prison in violence. Tank's reputation had been built on fear and dominance. Having that reputation shattered by a newcomer would require a response that restored the natural order, no matter how many people got hurt in the process. "How many men is he gathering?" David asked quietly. 20, maybe 30. All serious players with nothing to lose. Lifers, gang leaders from other blocks, guys who owe Tank favors. He's promising them territory, commissary money, whatever it takes. David closed his eyes and tried to find the center of calm that had sustained him through decades of training and teaching. But for the first time since arriving at Blackwater, he felt the weight of genuine concern settling on his shoulders. 30 violent men, armed and organized, coming for one middle-aged martial artist who just wanted to serve his time in peace. Even with all his training and experience, David knew that some battles couldn't be won through skill alone. The question wasn't whether he could survive what was coming. The question was how many innocent people would be hurt in the process, and whether standing his ground was worth the price that others might pay. That evening, as word spread through every cell block about the cafeteria incident, David sat quietly on his bunk, knowing that tomorrow would bring the storm he had been trying to avoid. The whispers carried details of Tank's growing alliance, names of dangerous men from every corner of the prison who had agreed to participate in what was being called the biggest coordinated attack in Blackwater's history. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 1 man against 30. Even Bruce Lee would have struggled with those odds, and David was no movie star. He was a middle-aged Taekwondo instructor whose knees creaked when he got out of bed, and whose reflexes, while still sharp, weren't what they had been 20 years ago. But there was something Tank and his new allies didn't understand about David Chen, something that went deeper than technique or physical ability. During his 2 decades of teaching martial arts, David had learned that the most dangerous fights weren't won by the strongest or fastest. They were won by the person who understood the battlefield better than anyone else. Prison was just another kind of battlefield, with its own rules and rhythms. And David had spent every moment since his arrival studying those rules with the same intensity he had once applied to mastering forms and sparring techniques. The next morning came with an electric tension that seemed to charge the very air in cell block C. David rose before the wake-up call, as was his habit, and began his daily routine of stretching and meditation. The familiar movements centered his mind and prepared his body for whatever the day might bring. Tommy stirred on the lower bunk, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You're up early again," he observed, watching David move through a series of precise exercises. "The body remembers discipline even when the mind wants to rest," David replied, completing his routine. "Today will require both." Word had already spread through the prison grapevine that Tank's alliance was making their move during breakfast. It was the perfect time for maximum impact, with minimal guard interference. The cafeteria would be crowded, visibility would be limited, and by the time security responded, the message would be sent. As they walked toward the cafeteria, Tommy stayed close to David's side, his nervousness obvious. "Man, maybe you should skip breakfast today. Stay in the cell. Let this whole thing blow over." David shook his head calmly. "Running away doesn't solve the problem. It just delays it. And delays give angry men time to plan worse things." The cafeteria felt different the moment they stepped inside. The usual morning chaos of conversations and clattering trays had been replaced by an unnatural quiet. Inmates moved carefully, keeping their heads down, sensing that something explosive was about to happen. Tank sat at his usual table, but today he wasn't alone. The faces surrounding him told the story of every alliance he had forged over the past 48 hours. Gang members from rival blocks who had set aside their differences for the promise of territory and respect. Lifers with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Men whose reputations were built on violence and maintained through fear. David took his tray and selected his food methodically, aware that every eye in the room was tracking his movements. He could feel the weight of anticipation pressing down like storm clouds before a hurricane. The question wasn't whether violence would erupt, but when and how devastating it would be. He chose a table in the center of the cafeteria, not hiding in corners or seeking protection near the guards. Right in the middle where everyone could see him, where there was nowhere to run. It was a calculated decision that spoke of either supreme confidence or complete resignation to his fate. The attack came without warning or ceremony. Tank's signal was subtle, just a slight nod of his head, but it unleashed chaos throughout the cafeteria. Men rose from tables across the room, moving with coordinated precision toward the quiet figure sitting calmly with his breakfast tray. What happened next defied every expectation and shattered every assumption about how prison fights were supposed to unfold. David didn't panic. He didn't scramble for weapons or call for help. Instead, he moved like water flowing around stones, his body shifting and turning with fluid precision that seemed to bend the laws of physics. The first attacker came from his left, swinging a sock filled with batteries in a wide arc aimed at David's skull. David leaned back just enough for the weapon to whistle past his face, then stepped forward and drove his palm into the man's solar plexus with surgical accuracy. The attacker doubled over, gasping as the makeshift weapon clattered to the floor. Two more rushed him from opposite sides, trying to overwhelm him with coordinated strikes. David dropped low, sweeping the legs of one while his elbow found the ribs of the other. Both men crashed into each other and tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs and curses. The room erupted into complete pandemonium as more inmates joined the assault. But David was no longer fighting individuals. He was fighting the entire mob, using their numbers against them, turning their aggression into a weapon that struck down their own allies. His movements were poetry written in violence, each technique flowing seamlessly into the next. A spinning heel kick that sent one man crashing into a table, an uppercut that lifted another clear off his feet, a throw that used an attacker's momentum to send him flying into three of his companions. Decades of training had prepared him not just for combat, but for this exact moment when skill would face overwhelming odds and emerge victorious through pure discipline and understanding of leverage, timing, and human mechanics. The cafeteria had become a battlefield, but it was unlike any fight the inmates or guards had ever witnessed. There were no wild swings or desperate grappling, no screaming or cursing, just David moving through his attackers like a dancer performing a deadly choreography, each movement precise and purposeful. Snake, who had recovered enough from their previous encounter to participate in the revenge plot, came at David with a sharpened spoon aimed at his kidneys. David caught his wrist mid-thrust, twisted sharply, and used Snake's own forward momentum to drive him face-first into the concrete floor. The improvised weapon skittered away as Snake lay motionless, blood pooling beneath his head. Brick, still moving slowly from his earlier concussion, tried to grab David from behind in a bear hug designed to crush his ribs. David dropped his weight, slipped out of the hold like smoke, and struck upward with his palm. The blow caught Brick under the chin with enough force to snap his head back violently. His eyes rolled up, and he collapsed backward onto an overturned table. One by one, Tank's carefully assembled army fell. Some were unconscious, others writhing in pain from precisely targeted strikes to pressure points and nerve clusters. A few had simply given up and retreated to the edges of the room, unwilling to face the quiet man who fought like a force of nature. Through it all, David's breathing remained controlled, his movements economical. He wasn't fighting with anger or desperation. He was simply applying techniques he had practiced 10,000 times in dojos across Portland, adapted now for a battlefield he had never wanted to enter. Tank watched his grand alliance crumble with growing horror and disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. 30 men against one should have been a slaughter. Instead, it looked like a martial arts demonstration, where David was the instructor showing students exactly how technique could triumph over brute force. When the last of his allies either fell or fled, Tank found himself standing alone in the center of the destroyed cafeteria, facing the man who had just dismantled his entire power structure with surgical precision. The king of Cell Block C, who had ruled through fear and violence for 4 years, suddenly looked very small and very vulnerable. David wiped a small amount of blood from his lip where one lucky punch had connected, and looked at Tank with something that might have been pity. "This didn't have to happen," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "All I ever wanted was to eat my meals in peace." Tank's face twisted with rage and humiliation. His reputation, his power, his entire identity had been destroyed in front of everyone who mattered. The fear that had protected him was gone, transferred to the quiet man standing calmly amid the wreckage of his empire. "You think this is over?" Tank snarled, pulling a crude knife from his waistband. "You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone and just walk away? I'd rather die than let some nobody fresh fish destroy everything I built." David sighed deeply, genuinely sad that it had come to this. "Then you've made your choice," he said simply. Tank charged forward with a desperate roar, the knife raised high above his head in a clumsy overhand strike fueled by desperation rather than skill. David stepped aside with minimal effort, caught Tank lock that sent the weapon's wrist, and applied a joint, spinning away across the blood-slicked floor. Tank's arm bent at an unnatural angle as David maintained the lock, applying just enough pressure to make his point clear. "Yield," David said quietly, giving Tank one final chance to end this with whatever dignity he had left. But Tank's pride wouldn't let him submit. Even with his arm trapped and his power broken, he tried to swing his free hand at David's head. It was a pathetic gesture, born of desperation and humiliation rather than any real hope of victory. David's response was swift and final. His free hand struck Tank's neck at a specific pressure point, cutting off the blood flow to his brain with surgical precision. Tank's eyes went wide with panic as consciousness began to fade, his body going limp as David gently lowered him to the floor. The cafeteria fell silent except for the groaning of injured men and the sound of approaching boots as guards finally arrived in force. David stood slowly, his orange jumpsuit torn and stained, but his posture still dignified, still calm. Sergeant Rodriguez burst through the entrance with a full tactical team, expecting to find multiple fatalities and a riot in progress. Instead, he discovered something that would be talked about in law enforcement circles for years to come. One man standing peacefully in the center of a room filled with defeated attackers, none of whom appeared to have suffered permanent injury, despite the obvious violence that had taken place. "What in God's name happened here?" Rodriguez demanded, surveying the destruction with experienced but bewildered eyes. David straightened his torn shirt and looked around at the men scattered across the floor like broken toys. 30 against 1, he said simply. It wasn't a fair fight. Rodriguez stared at him for a long moment, trying to process what he was seeing. In 15 years of corrections work, he had never encountered anything like this. The mathematical impossibility of one inmate defeating 30 others without weapons or backup defied every assumption about how prison violence worked. "Medical teams, get these men checked out," Rodriguez ordered his staff. "And you," he pointed at David. "Administrative segregation until we figure out exactly what we're dealing with here." As guards moved to escort him away, David caught sight of inmates throughout the cafeteria watching him with expressions he had never wanted to see. The fear, the awe, the calculating looks of men wondering how they could use his reputation for their own purposes. Tommy Rodriguez appeared at his side as they walked toward the exit, his face pale with shock. "Man, I can't believe what I just saw. 30 guys? And you took them all down without even breathing hard. What are you, some kind of secret weapon?" David was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. "I'm a teacher," he said finally. "I've always been a teacher. Today I just had to teach a very hard lesson about the difference between violence and discipline." The administrative segregation unit was quieter than solitary confinement, designed for inmates who needed protection rather than punishment. David's cell was larger, with a small window that let in natural light and a shelf where he could keep books. But even in isolation, word of the cafeteria incident spread through the prison like wildfire. Guards whispered about it during shift changes. Inmates passed the story through the communication networks that connected every cell block. The details grew in the telling, becoming legend before they became history. Within 24 hours, David Chen was no longer just another inmate serving time for assault charges, become something else entirely. He had a myth, a cautionary tale. The quiet man who had single-handedly Dizem in Blackwater State entered the most powerful gang penitentiary without breaking a sweat. Prison officials found themselves dealing with something unprecedented. They had an inmate who was simultaneously the most dangerous and the most peaceful person in their facility. David followed every rule, caused no trouble, and asked for nothing except to be left alone. Yet he had just demonstrated combat capabilities that bordered on superhuman. The warden, Margaret Sullivan, reviewed David's file for the third time in as many days, searching for clues about the man who had turned her side down. The prison-up paperwork told a simple story. Small business owner, no prior convictions, assault charges stemming from a bar fight that had escalated beyond reasonable force. But the bar fight details, when she read them carefully, began to paint a different picture. 7 men had attacked David outside a Portland nightclub. All 7 had ended up hospitalized. David had claimed self-defense, and security footage had supported his story. The district attorney had reduced the charges rather than face the embarrassment of prosecuting a man who had been clearly outnumbered and defending himself. Now Sullivan understood why David had seemed so calm during intake. This wasn't his first time facing impossible odds. It was just the first time he had faced them in her prison. The question that kept her awake at night was simple but troubling. What do you do with a man who can single-handedly defeat 30 attackers but has no interest in ruling anything or anyone? How do you maintain order in a facility where the most dangerous inmate is also the most disciplined? The answer would reshape how Blackwater State Penitentiary operated for years to come. But that's a story for another day, because David Chen's legend was just beginning to grow. 3 weeks passed in administrative segregation before Warden Sullivan made her decision. David would return to general population, but under conditions that had never been implemented at Blackwater before. He would have a single cell. His movements would be monitored, but not restricted. And most importantly, he would be allowed to teach. Teach what? David had asked during their meeting, genuinely surprised by the proposal. Whatever you think these men need to learn, Sullivan replied, sliding a proposal across her desk. Anger management, conflict resolution, self-discipline. Call it what you want. But I've got 800 inmates in this facility. And after what happened in that cafeteria, half of them are terrified, and the other half are planning how to challenge you. Neither scenario ends well. David read through the proposal carefully. The program would be voluntary. Classes would be held in the library 3 times a week. No more than 12 participants at a time. Guards would be present, but positioned at a distance to avoid intimidating students. Why? David asked, setting the papers down. Why take this risk? Sullivan leaned back in her chair, studying the man across from her desk. In 25 years of corrections work, she had never encountered an inmate quite like David Chen. Dangerous beyond measure, yet completely without malice. Capable of devastating violence, yet seeking only peace. Because what you did in that cafeteria wasn't just about fighting, she said finally. It was about control. Discipline. You took 30 men who wanted to hurt you and neutralized them without causing permanent damage. That's not the behavior of a typical violent offender. David considered her words carefully. Teaching had been his life before this place. The idea of returning to instruction, even in such an unusual setting, appealed to him more than he cared to admit. There would be rules, Sullivan continued. No physical contact between you and students. No demonstration of fighting techniques. This isn't about creating an army of martial artists. It's about teaching discipline and self-control to men who have very little of either. The first class drew an eclectic mix of inmates. Some came out of genuine curiosity about the man who had become a legend. Others attended hoping to learn secrets that might help them survive in Blackwater's harsh environment. A few arrived with barely concealed hostility, still loyal to Tank's fallen regime and looking for weakness they could exploit. David entered the library that first afternoon to find 12 men sitting in a rough-language Roddy circle, their body aiding everything from nervous anticipation to outright suspicion. He had changed since the cafeteria incident. Not physically, but something in his demeanor had shifted. The quiet confidence remained, but it was tempered now with a deeper understanding of the responsibility that came with his reputation. "My name is David Chen," he began, taking a seat among them rather than standing in a position of authority. "I'm here because Warden Sullivan thinks I might have something useful to share with you. I'm not entirely sure she's right, but I'm willing to try if you are." A young Latino inmate named Carlos raised his hand tentatively. "Are you going to teach us how to fight like you did? Because man, what you did to Tank's crew, that was like something out of a movie." David shook his head gently. What happened in the cafeteria was necessary, but it wasn't good. Violence should always be the last option, never the first. What I want to teach you is how to avoid reaching that point in the first place. An older black inmate named Jerome scoffed from across the circle. "Easy to say when you can drop 30 guys without breaking a sweat. Some of us ain't got that luxury. Some of us got to survive the hard way." "You're absolutely right," David replied, surprising Jerome with his agreement. "Not everyone can or should fight the way I did, but everyone can learn to control their reactions, to think before they act, to find strength in discipline rather than chaos." Over the following weeks, something remarkable began happening in Blackwater State Penitentiary. The men who attended David's classes started carrying themselves differently. They walked with more purpose, spoke with more consideration, responded to conflict with measured thinking, rather than instant aggression. The changes were subtle at first. Carlos stopped getting into shouting matches with his cellmate. Jerome began mediating disputes in his work detail, rather than escalating them. Even hardened lifers who had given up hope of ever changing found themselves reconsidering patterns of behavior that had defined their adult lives. David's teaching method was unlike anything the inmates had experienced. He didn't lecture about right and wrong or preach about rehabilitation. Instead, he shared stories from his years running a martial arts studio, tales of students who had overcome anger, fear, and self-doubt through discipline and practice. "I once had a student named Michael," David told them during a session about controlling temper. 15 years old, came to me after getting expelled from 3 schools for fighting. His mother was desperate. She brought him to my dojo as a last resort before sending him to military school. The inmates leaned in, drawn by David's quiet storytelling style. In a place where most communication was loud and aggressive, his calm voice commanded attention simply by being different. Michael's problem wasn't that he couldn't fight, David continued. His problem was that he couldn't stop fighting. Every disagreement became a battle. Every perceived slight required immediate retaliation. Sound familiar? Several heads nodded around the circle. The description resonated with men who had spent years reacting to every challenge with violence, every disrespect with immediate escalation. "The first thing I taught Michael wasn't a punch or a kick. It was how to breathe, how to recognize the physical signs of anger before it took control, how to create a space between stimulus and response where choice could exist." A new inmate named Dwayne, recently transferred from maximum security, spoke up with skepticism clear in his voice. "That meditation stuff might work on the outside, but in here, man, you show weakness for 1 second and you're done." "Predators smell fear like blood in the water." David nodded thoughtfully. "You're not wrong about the predators, but there's a difference between showing weakness and showing control. When you react instantly to every provocation, you're not showing strength. You're showing that others can control your actions simply by pushing the right buttons." The room fell quiet as the men considered this perspective. In an environment where reputation and respect were everything, the idea that quick retaliation might actually demonstrate a lack of control was revolutionary. Michael learned that the most powerful response isn't always the loudest or the most violent. David continued. "Sometimes the most powerful response is choosing not to respond at all, or responding in a way that diffuses rather than escalates." Over time, the classes evolved beyond simple discussions. David introduced breathing exercises that helped inmates manage stress and anxiety. He taught visualization techniques that allowed them to mentally rehearse calm responses to challenging situations. Most importantly, he helped them understand the difference between strength and aggression, between confidence and arrogance. The changes didn't go unnoticed by the prison staff. Incident reports in Cell Block C dropped by 60% in the first month after David's classes began. Guard injuries decreased significantly. Even the medical staff noted fewer inmates seeking treatment for fight-related injuries. But the most dramatic change was in the atmosphere of the prison itself. The constant tension that had defined daily life at Blackwater began to ease. Conversations replaced confrontations. Problems were increasingly resolved. Everyone embraced THED through discussion rather than violence, not changes. A faction of inmates, led by a lifer named Viper who had been Tank's main rival before the cafeteria incident, viewed David's influence with suspicion and resentment. They saw the growing calm as weakness, the reduced violence as an opportunity to seize power. Viper had spent 15 years building his own power base through careful alliances and strategic violence. He controlled the drug trade in Cell Block B and commanded respect through fear and brutality. The idea that some newcomer could reshape prison dynamics through teaching classes struck him as both impossible and insulting. "This whole peaceful warrior thing is gonna get people killed," Viper complained to his lieutenant, a scarred man called Razor. These fools think they can meditate their way out of trouble. Wait till someone really tests them. Wait till they realize all that breathing and thinking don't stop a shank from finding their ribs. Razor nodded agreement. But privately, he wondered if Viper was missing something important. The men attending David's classes weren't becoming weak. If anything, they seemed more confident, more self-assured. They just weren't looking for fights anymore. The test Viper predicted came during David's 6th week back in general population. A new inmate named Brutus arrived with a reputation that preceded him from 3 other prisons. 6'6", 280 pounds of muscle and rage, with a record of violence that included killing 2 other inmates and severely injuring a guard. Brutus was exactly the kind of predator that thrived in prison environments. He fed on fear and established dominance through overwhelming physical intimidation. Within hours of his arrival, word spread that he was looking for the famous David Chen, eager to claim the scalp that would instantly establish his position at the top of Blackwater's food chain. The confrontation came during evening recreation time in the yard. David was walking the perimeter track, as had become his habit, when Brutus stepped directly into his path. A crowd gathered quickly, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "So you're the little man who thinks he runs this place," Brutus rumbled, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "Heard you got lucky against some amateurs. Let's see how you do against a real killer." David stopped walking and looked up at the giant blocking his path. The size difference was even more dramatic than it had been with Tank. Brutus wasn't just large. He was enormous, with the kind of prison-built muscle that spoke of endless hours of working out and consuming whatever steroids could be smuggled inside. "I don't run anything," David replied calmly. "I'm just trying to walk in peace." Brutus laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the yard. "Peace? You think this is some kind of meditation retreat? This is prison, little man. Only the strong survive, and the weak get eaten alive." The crowd pressed closer, hungry for violence after weeks of relative calm. Some of David's students were, among them, watching nervously to see how their teacher would handle this ultimate test. "Strength comes in many forms," David said quietly. "The strongest person in any room is usually the one who doesn't need to prove it." Brutus's face darkened with rage. "You think you're better than me? You think your little karate tricks are gonna save you when I crush your skull like an eggshell?" Without warning, Brutus swung a massive fist toward David's head with enough force to shatter concrete. But David wasn't there when the blow arrived. He had shifted slightly to the left, and Brutus's punch whistled past harmlessly. What happened next was different from the cafeteria fight. David didn't immediately counterattack. Instead, he began moving in a wide circle around Brutus, forcing the larger man to turn and adjust constantly to keep him in sight. "Stand still and fight, you coward!" Brutus roared, swinging again and again as David flowed around him like water around a stone. The crowd watched in fascination as David demonstrated something they had never seen before. He was fighting without fighting, defending without attacking, controlling the encounter through movement and positioning, rather than strikes and blocks. Brutus grew increasingly frustrated as his powerful blows continued to meet empty air. His breathing became labored from the constant turning and swinging. Sweat poured down his face as his anger mounted. "What's wrong, big man?" David asked conversationally as he continued circling. "Getting tired? Maybe you should consider anger management classes." The taunt broke whatever remained of Brutus's control. He charged forward like a maddened bull, arms outstretched to grab David in a bear hug that would allow him to use his overwhelming size advantage. David waited until the last possible moment, then dropped to one knee and swept Brutus's legs with a technique so simple it was taught to white belt students. The giant's momentum carried him forward and down, his massive bulk crashing to the concrete with a sound like a falling tree. Before Brutus could recover, David was on his feet and walking away. "The strongest person," he called over his shoulder, "is the one who can end a fight without throwing a punch." The crowd stood in stunned silence as David continued his walk around the track, leaving Brutus sitting on the ground, unharmed but utterly humiliated. The giant killer who had terrorized 3 other prisons had been defeated by a man who had barely touched him. Carlos, who had witnessed the entire encounter, jogged to catch up with David. "Man, that was incredible. You made him look like a complete amateur without even hitting him." David nodded thoughtfully. "Brutus is dangerous because he's been taught that size and aggression are the only forms of power that matter. But there are other kinds of strength. Sometimes the most effective response to overwhelming force is simply to not be there when it arrives." Word of mouth. The encounter spread through the prison even faster than news of the cafeteria incident had. But this time, the story carried a different message. David hadn't just defeated another challenger. He had done so without causing injury, without humiliation beyond what Brutus had brought on himself, and without escalating the violence that defined prison life. The demonstration had a profound effect on both David's students and the general population. Men who had spent years believing that violence was the only solution to conflict began reconsidering their assumptions. If someone like Brutus could be neutralized through technique and positioning rather than brute force, what other problems might have nonviolent solutions? Viper watched these developments with growing concern. His power base depended on maintaining an environment where violence was the primary currency of respect. David's influence was threatening not just individual inmates, but the entire system that kept men like Viper in control. "We got to do something about this," Viper told Razor during a private meeting in the laundry room. "This Chen character is making everyone soft. Pretty soon, nobody's gonna respect the old ways. Nobody's gonna fear what they should fear." Razor shifted uncomfortably. He had been thinking about attending one of David's classes himself, though he would never admit it to Viper. "Maybe the old ways ain't working as good as we thought. I mean, look around. Less fighting, less stress. Even the guards are treating people better. Maybe change ain't such a bad thing." Viper's eyes flashed with dangerous anger. "You going soft on me too? You forget who kept you alive your first year in here? Who made sure the Aryans didn't carve you up for sport?" "I ain't forgetting nothing," Razor replied carefully. "I'm just saying maybe there's more than one way to survive in this place. Maybe David's way ain't wrong, just different." The conversation ended with tension hanging heavy between them, but it represented a shift that was happening throughout Blackwater. Men who had followed the old code of violence and intimidation were beginning to question whether that code was truly serving them. David's classes continued to grow. Inmates who had initially resisted now found themselves curious about the techniques that had transformed their fellow prisoners. The library sessions expanded from 12 participants to 20, then to 30. Warden Sullivan observed these changes with cautious optimism. Incident reports continued to decline. Medical costs dropped as fewer inmates required treatment for fight-related injuries. Even the correctional officers reported improved morale as their jobs became less dangerous and stressful. But she also knew that change in prison environments was fragile. Years of ingrained behavior patterns couldn't be altered overnight, and there would always be those who preferred the old ways of doing things. The real test would come when David's sentence ended and he returned to the outside world. Would the changes he had inspired continue, or would Blackwater revert to its previous culture of violence and intimidation? That test was still 18 months away, but David had already begun preparing his students for his eventual departure. He was training the most dedicated participants to lead sessions themselves, passing on not just techniques, but the philosophy behind them. "The goal isn't to create dependence," he explained to Carlos, Jerome, and several others who had shown leadership potential. "The goal is to plant seeds that continue growing long after the gardener is gone." As David approached his 2-year mark at Blackwater, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that first day in the cafeteria. He had arrived as a man seeking only to serve his time quietly and return to his former life. Instead, he had become a teacher once again, helping others find the discipline and self-control that had taken him decades to develop. The irony wasn't lost on him. Prison, the place designed to punish and confine, had become a classroom where some of society's most troubled men were learning lessons that might transform not just their time behind bars, but their entire futures. The transformation David had sparked at Blackwater reached far beyond the concrete walls of Cell Block C. News of the reformed prison environment began attracting attention from corrections officials across the state. Wardens from other facilities started requesting transfers to observe David's program firsthand, hoping to replicate the results in their own institutions. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a criminologist from the State University, arrived to conduct a formal study of what was being called the Blackwater model. She spent weeks interviewing inmates, guards, and administrators, documenting the statistical improvements in violence reduction and recidivism rates among program participants. "What you've accomplished here defies conventional wisdom about prison rehabilitation," she told David during one of their recorded interviews. "Most programs focus on punishment and deterrence. Yours focuses on internal transformation. The preliminary data suggests participants are 60% less likely to reoffend upon release." David listened thoughtfully, still uncomfortable with the attention his work was receiving. "The credit belongs to the men who chose to change, not to me. I just provided some tools and perspective." But the numbers didn't lie. Inmates who had completed David's program showed remarkable improvements across every metric corrections officials tracked. Disciplinary infractions dropped to almost zero. Educational program enrollment increased dramatically. Even family visitation rates improved as men rebuilt relationships they had damaged through years of destructive behavior. The success story wasn't universal, however. Viper's resistance had crystallized into something more dangerous than simple disagreement. He had begun organizing what he called traditionalists, inmates who viewed the changing prison culture as a threat to the natural order that had governed their world for decades. "These bleeding hearts think they can meditation their way out of reality," Viper preached to his followers during clandestine meetings in the machine shop. "But reality don't care about your feelings. Reality don't care about your breathing exercises. When someone comes for you with a shank, you better be ready to fight back harder than they're ready to fight." His words found fertile ground among certain inmates who thrived in chaotic environments. Men whose power and identity were built on the ability to inflict fear needed violence to maintain their relevance. Without conflict, they became ordinary, unremarkable, forgotten. The philosophical divide created two distinct populations within Blackwater. Those who embraced David's teachings formed a growing community of mutual support and personal development. Those who rejected change retreated into increasingly isolated pockets of traditional prison culture, clinging to familiar patterns of aggression and intimidation. The tension between these groups created an undercurrent of unease that David recognized from his early days teaching martial arts in rough neighborhoods. He had seen similar dynamics play out in communities where change threatened established power structures. The question wasn't whether conflict would emerge, but how devastating it would be when it finally erupted. The answer came during the third week of March, when a new shipment of inmates arrived from overcrowded facilities across the state. Among them was a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm front. They called him Reaper, and his file read like a catalog of institutional nightmares. Reaper had spent the last 15 years moving between maximum security facilities, leaving a trail of violence and chaos wherever he went. Guards retired early after encounters with him. Other inmates requested protective custody rather than share cell blocks with his presence. He represented everything that David's program stood against: uncontrolled rage, predatory behavior, and absolute contempt for any form of rehabilitation. Within hours of his arrival, Reaper had allied himself with Viper's traditionalists. The combination proved volatile immediately. Reaper possessed the physical capability to back up Viper's philosophy with devastating force, while Viper provided the organizational structure and institutional knowledge that Reaper's chaotic nature lacked. Their first collaborative effort targeted one of David's most successful students, Marcus Thompson, a young man serving time for armed robbery, had transformed dramatically during his 8 months in the program. Once quick to anger and violence, he had become a peacemaker among the younger inmates, helping them navigate conflicts without resorting to aggression. The attack came without warning during evening recreation. Marcus was reading in the library when Reaper and 2 of Viper's enforcers cornered him between the stacks. They didn't want to hurt him permanently. That would bring too much official attention. They wanted to break his spirit, to demonstrate that David's teachings were useless against real predators. "Heard you're one of Chen's meditation boys," Reaper said, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone who had killed without remorse. "Let's see how deep your inner peace goes when the real world comes calling." Marcus felt his old instincts surge, the familiar rush of adrenaline that had once led him to pull a gun on a convenience store clerk. But David's training kicked in automatically. He breathed deeply, centered his thoughts, and looked for ways to de-escalate rather than fight. "I don't want trouble," Marcus said calmly, surprising himself with how steady his voice remained. "Whatever point you're trying to make, there's got to be a better way." Reaper laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Better way? Boy, you sound like some kind of social worker. This ain't group therapy. This is prison. And in prison, the strong take what they want from the weak." The attack was swift and brutal. Reaper didn't use weapons. He didn't need them. His fists were registered weapons in 3 states, and he knew exactly how to inflict maximum pain without causing injuries that would show up on medical examinations. But something unexpected happened during the assault. Marcus didn't break. He absorbed the punishment without begging, without abandoning the principles David had taught him. Even as pain exploded through his body, he maintained his breathing, kept his mind clear, and looked for opportunities to protect himself without escalating the violence. David Chen walked out of Blackwater State Penitentiary 18 months later, carrying the same worn duffel bag he had brought in, but everything else had changed. The prison he left behind operated on principles that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. Violence had been replaced by dialogue. Fear had given way to respect. And the man who had transformed it all disappeared back into the world as quietly as he had arrived. The program he created continued long after his release. Marcus Thompson became one of its most effective leaders, teaching other young inmates the same lessons that had saved his life during Reaper's attack. The breathing techniques, the conflict resolution skills, the understanding that true strength comes from within, all of it lived on in the men David had touched. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the least threatening. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not through violence, but through the discipline to avoid it. And sometimes a single act of courage, standing up to a bully with nothing but inner strength, can change not just one life, but hundreds. David returned to Portland and reopened his martial arts studio. He never spoke publicly about his time in prison, but those who knew him noticed something different, a deeper calm, a wisdom that comes only from teaching in the hardest classroom of all. The quiet man who had once poured coffee on his head learned that respect isn't taken, it's earned, and the strongest warriors are often the gentlest souls.